Would you ask Ms. Wray to come back in, please? Right, Ms. Wray, ready to carry on?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would you agree with me that anyone reading Carl Stokes' fire risk assessments for Grenfell Tower after December 2010, using the definition that you have used, would think that these were firefighting and evacuation lifts that could be used for the evacuation of disabled persons?
Yes, I would agree.
You would. And would you agree that that would be misleading?
Absolutely.
Yes. And would you agree that you should not have instructed him to use a definition that did not conform to industry standards?
Yes, but I didn't instruct him, but I take your point, yes.
Or allow him then?
Yes, and I genuinely tried not to. And I would also just add that I would never have let them be used as evacuation lifts. Yes.
Now, you say in your third statement, and it's paragraph 91, perhaps we should go to it, TMO 00847-305, page 26, paragraph 91. I think we've looked at this before. You say, I was aware, in the fourth line, I was aware that the TMO lifts did not meet all of the requirements. I brought this to the attention of Carl Stokes. However, my recollection is that he remained resolute in his belief that they were firefighting lifts. How and when did you bring that to Carl Stokes' attention, do you say?
Always verbally, usually in person, not on the phone, on a number of occasions. I won't remember the dates, but I would say I'm absolutely convinced that they're not firefighting lifts because remember the correspondence we had with Salvis and Robin, and they don't have a hatch, but also they only meet a limited number of the criteria, and he would generally be focused on the fact that he said they had dual power supplies, and therefore they did. And so we always got to an impasse where he didn't move from his position and I didn't move from mine, which wasn't satisfactory.
Was there a reason why, at some point, you didn't simply record formally the impasse that you say you'd arrived with him?
No, there wasn't any reason.
Rather than doing it, as you call it, verbally, why not just write to him formally and say, I insist that you are wrong and you need to record this fact in your FRAs? Yeah,
perhaps I should have done that. I just thought that I would be able to get through to him better verbally, that I would explain why I felt what my judgment was based on. And it was based on discussions with a senior lift engineer, and that was his specialism, and his view was that none of our lifts, all of the stuff that we discussed this morning, really,
right.
But I couldn't get past it.
Well, let's see what he says. Can we go to his witness statement, please, at page 44? That's CST 403063, at page 44. And let's look together at paragraph 124. The foot of... well, I think we probably need the bottom of page 43 for the beginning of the passage. There's a heading, firefighter lifts, the foot of page 43. And he says, in the FRAs I note that the two lifts at the tower were, quote, firefighting lifts, unquote. This was based on confirmation from the KCTMO that this was the case, both when I was first involved with the tower, and he gives a document, and subsequently when I was provided lists of the KCTMO buildings which had firefighting lifts, see email 6th June 2012, a copy of which is also at the back of KCTMO's fire safety policy. Now what do you say about that?
I think that's not an accurate reflection of the many discussions we had on the issue. Over quite a long period, it got raised periodically, and I was very clear that I thought he was wrong.
Right,
and that's not what it says here.
Right, but he's right, isn't he? That so far as the documents are concerned, Grenfell Tower was included on the list of buildings with a firefighting lift.
In terms of the criteria that had been set out, yes.
Well, you say that, and you've said it a lot, but nowhere did you say to Carl Stokes, look, if you're going to call it a firefighting lift, tell people that it is only a firefighting lift in accordance with the definition coined by the TMO in-house and not with British standards.
I would have said that, but not in writing.
Right. Now, if we go to your third witness statement, paragraph 91, we've just been on, TMO 00847305. If we look at paragraphs 91 to 95, at pages 26 to 27, we could just scroll down through those just to identify them for people. Do you accept that you were either copied into emails or sent direct correspondence by Carl Stokes over the years, at least between 2011 and 2014 in particular, when he referred to the lifts as firefighting lifts? And in all of those instances, we see no evidence at all that you corrected his impression that they were not firefighting lifts.
I accept that's the case, yes.
Yes. Did the fact that you had thought he was wrong over not just weeks and months, but years, not give you cause to question his competency more generally?
No, there weren't. There were several things on which we didn't agree, and this was probably the main one. But no, I wouldn't say that it did generally. I think with most people there are things you agree and things you don't agree, and overwhelmingly, that I didn't have an issue with it. There were just a few specific things.
I mean, you did understand, did you? Or maybe you didn't. That the FRA, although prepared by Carl Stokes as an independent person retained by you, was your FRA.
Yes,
it was the TMO's FRA. Yes. Yeah. So if that's the case, why did you allow the TMO to publish perpetually a statement that was erroneous?
I can only reiterate what I've said, is that he remained very firmly of a view, and his view wasn't shakeable. What we'd found from discussions with the fire brigade, that actually what they needed to know was whether the lifts could be used as a fireman's lift so that they could take control over it. And overwhelmingly that was the case, and they were happy with those arrangements. I wasn't going to use them as evacuation lifts, and I was not going to let them be used as evacuation lifts. So I suppose I didn't put as much store by it as I should. In retrospect, obviously I didn't.
You see, do you understand that people reading the FRAs, including the residents of Grenfell Tower who asked for and got the 2012 FRA, would be led to think that their lifts in their building were firefighting lifts and evacuation lifts?
Yes.
And therefore, why did you allow that false representation to be perpetuated over years?
I can't add anything to what I've already said.
I
really tried to address it, and I wasn't able to persuade Carl, and he firmly viewed his position to be right and mine to be wrong, and I should have thought of taking some independent view, but I didn't.
Yes, that's the question. Why didn't you go to just take a second opinion, or get a limited further FRA report on the question of lifts and publish that at the same time?
I should have done clearly, right. And I mean, I can only reiterate that the fire brigade's interest was largely confined to whether the fireman's lift and making sure that when they turned up to take control that all worked seamlessly. So we concentrated on that, and I knew I wasn't going to use them as an evacuation lift, so I just didn't focus on what I should have done.
Well, all right, but if you didn't think he was right about lifts and was dogged in sticking to his position, and you'd reached an impasse, as you call it, why did you continue to use him at all as your FRA?
Well, you asked me if that was a warning sign, and it wasn't, because we were happy with the quality of his work. We just had a few things that we disagreed, and as we spoke already about the legal statement that he puts in all of his FRAs, that I don't particularly want him to put that in, but he felt really strongly that was an accurate representation of not having to share our FRAs with anybody, so he felt strongly it should be in. So in the end, I lived with it because I was happy with most of the quality of what he was producing.
See, being happy with most of the quality that what he's producing in the context of health and safety isn't really good enough, is it?
Well, I don't suppose you're ever going to be... I doubt you'll find anyone who's 100% happy with everything they get from anybody, really. I probably didn't phrase it very well, but there were just a couple of things that I didn't agree with, but overwhelmingly I did.
Now, let's turn then to the fire safety strategy of November 2013 that we know from your earlier evidence you drafted. The final version is at TMO 00830598. We looked at it together last week. If we go straight to page 12, let's look at section 18.2 under the heading Fire Safety and TMO Lifts, and 18.2 Firefighting Lifts. You see, that's actually the heading. And it goes on to say, as much of the housing stock is medium rise and high rise, many of the blocks are served by one or more passenger lifts. Where appropriate, quotes, firefighting lifts, unquotes, are provided within TMO residential blocks. This is to satisfy the requirements of the building regulations, which consider the height of the building, etc. When lifts are installed, they comply with the relevant standards at that time, and when they are subsequently replaced, the replacement lift is compliant with the standards current at the time of replacement. The criteria for a TMO firefighting lift is set out below. Now, do you agree that that paragraph doesn't indicate to the reader that the lifts only possess certain features of a firefighting lift properly so called?
It doesn't make it explicit, no.
No, and doesn't say that the TMO firefighting lift, which you there have put in quotation marks, is a self-defined criteria different from the industry standard firefighting lift, does it?
No, it doesn't.
And would you agree also that in using the term firefighting lift as the heading to the paragraph, and then repeatedly through the paragraph, that would give, or tend to give, the impression to the reader that the lifts were in fact firefighting lifts, according to the standard definition?
It may have done.
Yes. And that was misleading all round?
Potentially, yes.
Yes, potentially. And certainly it could create the confusion about the status of the lift and the additional protection that it could provide. Yes?
Potentially, yes.
Yes. And you'd enshrine that into a foundational document, namely the TMO's fire safety strategy.
Yes.
Now, when it came to drafting the 2017 strategy, the one that was adopted the day before the fire, this paragraph was not materially amended, was it? Would you like to look at it?
Well, no, if you say not, then that's fine. I can't really recall, but yeah.
Well, I don't want to put something to you that isn't right. TMO 00832-724, page 13, please. We could probably have them both outside, side by side if it were possible to do that. It's become 19.
Yeah.
So it's become, and specifically 19.2, firefighting lifts. If you just read the text there,
Yeah, no,
you
you're
agree
right.
with me
It's
that,
not.
yes. So you accept that there was no material amendment
No.
come June 2017 when this new strategy was adopted. My question is, why was that? Why was there no amendment to that?
I suppose, well, I should have been clearer about what I was defining because nothing else had changed. The lifts we had were still not firefighting lifts or evacuation lifts, and they still largely in the higher rise buildings met the criteria that we'd identified. So I should have been explicit.
Right. Let's look and see how this was presented to the LFB. Can we go back to your third statement, please, now, and pick it up at paragraph 96 on page 28? At the top of the screen, you say, "It's my belief that we informed the LFB that the lifts were not firefighting lifts, as this is what the TMO's lift engineer advised me. I passed this information on to Carl Stokes." First question is, was that Robin Callan's 28th of February 2011 email we saw?
Yes, and obviously in other verbal conversations as well.
Yeah, and when you say you passed this information on to Carl Stokes, is that the email 27, well, the 3rd of March, which we saw?
Yes.
The 3rd of March 2010. Yes. Now, let's look on to 2012. If we go to CST 402920, you can see that you wrote to Nicholas Cummery at the LFB on the 29th of May 2012.
Okay.
And it's the second email down from you to Nicholas Cummery, re Trellick Tower. And if you look at item 3,
Yeah.
you say this: "In discussions with your predecessors, we clarified that many of our lifts meet the majority, but not all, of the criteria for firefighting lifts. For example, we do not install a trapdoor, stroke hatch in the roof of the car, etc. It was agreed that we would clarify the criteria that our firefighting lifts, quotes unquote, do meet, and I have attached an email to the then Borough Commander Brian Deans setting out these criteria. Additionally, I attach a list of the blocks where these lifts are located, and you will see this includes Trellick Tower. And you can also see that, in fact, that's sent on to Carl Stokes at the top of the screen, if we just pick that up.
Yeah.
So would you just accept, or perhaps agree with me, looking at that so far as you were concerned, Carl Stokes would have read this and perhaps realised that the firefighting lifts, as a phrase, was a TMO coinage rather than meeting the...
I think he was aware that it was just limited criteria.
Yes.
I'm absolutely convinced he was. And this is another example of something that it's not ambiguous, it's clear. And I'm sure I would have copied other older correspondence, as well as you referred to the email directly from Robin Callan. So yeah, I do think he was clear what I was saying.
Right. So then let's look at an email earlier on, CST 402922. This is historical. You refer to Brian Deans in the email we've just seen.
Yes.
This is looking back at 2 years or so to the 8th of July 2010, when you write to John Calvert and Brian Deans at the London Fire Brigade, copy to Robin Callan, and you say there, in the second sentence, whilst it is acknowledged that our lifts do not fully satisfy all of the criteria for firefighting lifts, we can confirm that they meet the following. And then you set out what we've seen set out in your 27th of February 2011 Callaghan email and later on. Now, on either of those occasions, did you get a response from either John Calvert or Brian Deans?
I honestly don't know. Sorry, it's just...
Right.
It's just so long ago, I don't know. But I did have dealings periodically with Brian Dean, so it's possible.
Right.
It's possible, but I can't confirm, sorry.
Did you get a response to your 2012 email to Nicholas Cummery about the limitations that you were attaching to firefighting lifts as a definition?
I don't know that either, sorry.
Right. Did the LFB ever raise with you any concern that they had that the TMO lifts did not meet the full criteria in accordance with national standards which pertain to firefighting lifts or evacuation lifts?
Not to my knowledge.
When Nicholas Cummery retired, did you seek to inform his successor, Rebecca Burton, that the lifts were not firefighting lifts, but only so-called firefighting lifts in accordance with a TMO definition?
I don't recall that conversation.
No. Right. Is there a reason why you didn't tell her that, or did you make assumptions that she would have read the correspondence going back 5 years?
Sorry, I absolutely no idea. I don't know that we ever had a discussion. If we'd had a discussion, then I would have been clear, but I'm not sure that we proactively raised it with her. And to be honest, it was generally the operational crews who were most keen to be aware, if anyone.
Right. I'd now like to go to some specific issues about the lifts and start in April 2010. Can we please go to IWS 401463? This is the report of attendance of a primary incident we looked at this morning, first thing.
Okay.
This time let's look at lifts. We looked at it in the context of the AOV. It's for Grenfell, as you know, and it relates to the fire in Grenfell Tower on the 30th of April 2010. And if we go to page 2, you can see on that page firefighting action. You see that? And then in the last part of that part, were building firefighting facilities used? Yes. And then reason facility did not work? Nothing. And then type of facility, firefighting lift. Facility used? No. Was facility required? True. In other words, yes. Reason facility did not work, if applicable, poor maintenance. Now, I know you didn't see this report, as you told us this morning, but did you otherwise know that poor maintenance was one of the causes of the failure by the firefighters to take control of the lifts at the 30th of April 2010 fire?
That's actually not the case, because we were told immediately after the fire that the lift hadn't worked, so we sent the engineers I think it happened on a Friday night, so probably the next working day, to investigate, and there was no defect. They couldn't replicate a defect. So I advised the fire brigade, and we met operational, I think possibly the station manager, with some of the local crews on site on the Monday or Tuesday of the following week. And we went through with them how to take control of the lift, and just to confirm the arrangements for that, but also in the course of the conversation, they felt that they may have exceeded the safe working load because the number of firefighters who'd gone in with their breathing apparatus almost definitely exceeded the safe working load. So I think that the lift hadn't worked because of their action, and that was a discussion we had, and they accepted that that was probably it. So I think when this was written, that may have been what they believed to be the case, but subsequent investigation proved not to be so.
Well, this was written into the December of
Well,
that year.
it was published in the December, but
Well, it's dated December.
well, I'm just telling you what did the investigations
So
that we undertook with the brigade. Yeah.
So you challenged the reason facility did not work for maintenance. You
Well,
said
we
that's wrong.
investigated it because that's what we were required to do, and on the basis of the investigation, we couldn't replicate the defect. So we knew that this didn't seem to make any sense. So we asked the fire brigade if they'd be prepared to meet us on site at Grenfell Tower.
Yes, you explained. Did you get a report from the lift engineers, the TMO lift engineer, about the incident?
I would have at least had a verbal report from the TMO lift engineer. It was possibly still Robin at that time. I'm not quite sure.
Is there a reason why you didn't ask for a written report from Robin Callon?
I didn't consider one to be necessary. He attended the site meeting with me and with the brigade, and we had a kind of robust conversation and tried to establish the root of the problem, which seemed to be the sensible way to proceed.
Do you remember whether checking of the fire control switch was part of the testing that was done the day after the fire?
I'm sure it would have had to be, because we sent the engineers to do a thorough check on the lift because we've got a fire and we're being told by the fire and rescue service that it didn't operate the way that it should. So they couldn't have confirmed to us they couldn't have confirmed to us that it was fully operational, and they hadn't been able to identify a defect. If they didn't investigate that, that would have been a very obvious thing for them to do.
Were any changes made following the fire in April 2010?
In terms of the lift maintenance? Or?
Yes, in terms of the fire switch, in terms of the lift operation.
No, just the only change was that I believe that I think I put something in writing to the brigade just to confirm how they took control of the lift and how it worked locally. And because I think they requested that, but I don't think there were any other changes, no.
And were there any changes in the maintenance regime of the lifts after this fire?
Not that I'm aware of, because as we say, it seemed not to have been a maintenance fault. It seemed to have been sort of problem with operation.
Now, can we go to TMO 00855528? This is 2013 now. If we look at page 1, second email down on that page, TMO 00855528. If we look at the second email down on that page, we can see that there's an email from you to Peter Madison and others, in which you discuss the LFB's fire safety exercise at Grenfell Tower on the previous Friday. You see that?
Yes.
And that was following the May 2013 power surges, wasn't it?
It may have been. I had virtually no involvement in the power surges. It came from, we're always keen to promote familiarisation, and we'd done quite a successful exercise at Trellick Tower, and we proposed, where we advised residents in advance, and then the brigade also offered them a home fire safety visit as part of the exercise, and we planned to roll it out across the stock. But actually, before we could do that, Councillor Blakeman requested that we do the same at Grenfell Tower, and there had been a bit of a delay just because in terms of the resourcing available to the fire brigade. So it was in relation to that. If it coincided with the surges, then I'm not really aware of that. It wasn't on my radar.
The answer to my question, I think, is yes, it was following it, but not as a result of it.
Yes, sorry.
Right.
Long-winded, but yes, that's what I meant to say.
Then if we look at the bottom of the page, you say, this was also helpful for the TMO as two very minor issues were highlighted. We are now able to address these. Specifically, these were in relation to, and if we turn to page 2, second item, clarification on the operation of the override switch, which puts the lift under firefighters' control. Lift engineers have now been asked to provide a copy of the manufacturer's instructions.
Yep.
So that was what you said. And then can I just show you another document? TMO 008555611. This is another email from you, 18th July 2013. We need page 2 of that, where you write to Richard Burke, 18th July, read Grenfell Tower lifts. Page 2, and you say, Richard, appreciate your comprehensive response. Grateful if you could advise on one simple point, please. How should the LFB operate this switch? I was on site recently with them and witnessed them turn the key in both directions, panicking, as they were unclear of what to do, and further they were not sure when the lifts had transferred to their control and when they were still available to passengers for normal use. Therefore, if I could provide the LFB with very simple instructions on how they should proceed, I think that would be helpful them and would reduce the likelihood of our lift becoming damaged, etc. Now, looking at that one, but looking also at the previous email, what was the problem? What was the problem with the switch?
We have a variety of lifts, and I think they're all slightly quirky, and I think they just weren't familiar. It was possibly a crew who hadn't done familiarisation before. They weren't. It was very simple kind of drop switch. It turned out to be you turn it in one direction to take control of the lift, and you turn it in the other direction to go back into normal service. But you can't always immediately tell that you've now got control of the lift. So what this confirmed is if they step into the car and press a floor, they can tell that they've got control of the lift. So they were just asking for clarity, which I believe we did provide.
Did the LFB struggle to operate the fire control switch? Clearly, it looks like...
I think they must have on that day, and the feedback I had from, I think, the station manager was it would be helpful if we could just clarify.
Right. Did you organise any testing of the switch in order to make sure it was working?
I can't recall. Whatever I've done, I would have done in conjunction with the lift engineer, because I wouldn't normally go straight to the contractor, so they would have been aware. I can't recall.
Right. Were any faults in the fire control switch identified?
No,
right.
No.
Now let's look at Richard Burke's response, page 1. Good morning, Janice. 19th of July 2013. The fire recall switch itself is marked with 2 opposing red arrows. See below picture. There's a detail here from Richard Burke, who was Managing Director of Independent Lift Services at Raynham in Essex. Was this response sent on to the LFB so that they would know how to work the thing?
Either this was sent on or we did a bullet point summary. I can't recall which, but we certainly would have provided what they requested.
Right, I see. How were matters left with the LFB after that, so far as the switch, the fireman's switch, is concerned?
I think they were clear about and confident about what they do in order to take control and how to reinstate it subsequently. Right.
Now, in respect of the replacement of the lifts at Grenfell Tower, you were aware, I think, that the lifts were replaced in 2005, weren't they?
Yes.
Yes. And you deal with that in your third witness statement, at paragraph 88 at pages 25 to 26. And I'll summarise it for you without needing to go there. You say that you had no role in the replacement of the lifts at Grenfell Tower in 2005. You say this was a capital project managed by the TMO's Asset and Regeneration Department, not the Health and Safety team. But do you recall yourself having some involvement in that project in the early stages?
I didn't recall, but I can see that I attended, I think, a progress meeting or an initial feasibility or, I think I attended 1 or 2 meetings.
Yes, but you did. We have some examples of that in July 2003 and March 2004, yes?
Yes.
Do you remember the budget
No. Sorry.
I think you were there for the confirmation of the budget at £672,000. Do you remember that?
No.
Okay. There was a meeting in April 2004 and again in November 2004, both of which you were present for. But let's go to the last of those, APX 408294. This is the minute of a pre-start meeting at Grenfell Tower Estate Office on Tuesday, the 30th of November 2004, and we can see you're present there.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
As is Robin Callan.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go to page 1, you can see the contract. Sorry, you need to go lower down the screen. Item 2, contract particulars and scope of the works, is discussed. And in section or paragraph 2.2, it says this: the selected towers scheme would provide a 45% to 50% increase in lift car size and 10% increase in entrance dimensions, together with an increase in contract speed of 30%, thus achieving an improvement in traffic handling of around 30 to 35%. Just in general, Ms. Wray, what was your role in those meetings between July 2003 and November 2004, the last of which I'm showing you?
I think it was more to do with the fact that we were going to do tenant in place works on the block, and to have kind of a watching brief on what we were putting in place to protect the tenants, to advise them if there were going to be any other enhanced risks. It was a bit of an overview, really.
To your knowledge, did anyone consider whether the height of Grenfell Tower, which was more than 18 metres, affect the type of lifts which ought to be installed?
Sorry, I can't remember.
Was there any discussion about that? Do you remember?
Again, it's so long ago, I really can't recall.
You don't remember that. Did anyone consider, as part of that project, whether firefighting lifts were required to be installed at Grenfell Tower in accordance with current standards?
Again, I've got no recollection.
At any time after the upgrade project, it finished in 2006, until the night of the fire at Grenfell Tower on the 14th of June 2017. Did you or anybody else you know of at the TMO ever subsequently consider upgrading the lifts so that they met the full criteria for firefighting lifts, properly so called?
I'm not aware, but again, I would expect that the contract management team would be the people who would have put forward proposals for the works they were doing or the works they were proposing to do. They would have known what their budgets were, what their priorities were, and I wouldn't necessarily have been party to any of that.
Let's then turn to a new topic, which is the fire safety issues at Grenfell Tower after the refurbishment. And I want to focus for the moment on external facades. Can we start with that, please, with your first statement again, please? TMO 50890, page 14, and let's look together at paragraphs 65 and 66. Under the heading, Modifications to the Exterior of Grenfell Tower between 2012 and 2016, including cladding and insulation, you say this: I did not have anything to do with the selection, provision or installation of cladding or insulation during the refurbishment. And then at paragraph 66 you say, I have no knowledge and would not have the technical expertise to assess whether the exterior of Grenfell Tower was compliant with relevant building regulations, fire regulations, other legislation, British standards, guidance and industry practice. Nor do I have any knowledge of what advice or information was available and what assessments were made about the components that comprised the exterior of Grenfell Tower, its fire safety, fire resistance and compliance with safety standards, including information or advice from manufacturers of relevant components. Now, before the Grenfell Tower fire in June 2017, were you aware that there was cladding and insulation being applied to the exterior of that building?
Not initially, because I wasn't part of the design team. I knew the works. I didn't really know the scope of the works, actually, for quite some time. So I became aware of it possibly whenever Carl saw a trial piece on the building that he mentioned to me. I wouldn't have known the scope of the works necessarily. So I don't know at what point I became aware of it, but certainly well in advance of 2017.
You say well in advance of 2017, and you mention a trial piece. Would that have been in the summer, June, July of 2014?
That might have been.
Just to be clear, was that at a time when RBKC's planning department was being asked to view the type of rain screen, colour, I should say, and finish of rain screen?
I'm not sure why it was there. I just recall that in discussion with Carl, he had said, "Oh, I wasn't aware," or he advised that he'd become aware of the fact that there was going to be cladding put on the building. He'd seen a piece, and he was asking questions about the fixings
Right.
and whether they were metal. And so at that point, it was sort of, I was aware, but not to any extent.
Right. Having become aware from, it sounds, at least roughly, to be the middle of 2014, of the fact that a cladding system was going to be applied to the exterior of Grenfell Tower, did you ever think that you would need to know about whether the cladding was compliant with building regulations from a health and safety perspective?
I believed that the design team, the project team, had quite significant level of competence in all sorts of specialist areas, and that anything would have had to have building regulations approval, and those people were all technical experts in their field. So I believed that we had the right people in place to advise us.
Yes. Leaving that on one side, and I understand your answer, did you ever think that cladding could affect fire safety for the residents of the building or employees of the TMO who might be working in it?
I knew that there were instances of cladding being problematic, but I didn't throughout the world, but I didn't necessarily know in detail, and I believe that everybody who was technically competent and working on the project probably knew an awful lot more about those issues and how to avoid them and how to be compliant.
Now, you gave considerable amounts of evidence last week about your familiarity with the LGA guide.
Yes.
Did you know at the time, that is from the summer of 2014, if that is the right time, that the LGA guide had guidance in it about external fire spread?
Yes, a bit, yeah.
Yes, well, let's just look at it. We don't need to spend too much time reading it all out, but let's look at it. HOM 45964 at page 111. Let's look at page 111, paragraph 72. Under the diagram, external fire spread. The external facades of blocks of flats should not provide potential for extensive fire spread. And it continues. And if you just read on and look into paragraph 72.2 as well, can we take it that you were aware of those principles, at least in general terms?
Yes.
Yes. And then if you go to page 129, paragraph 85, this governs controlling alterations so they are not detrimental to fire safety. Again, can we take it that you are aware of the principles set out in paragraphs 85.1 and 85.2 there, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And of course, the Grenfell Tower refurbishment was a large-scale refurbishment programme, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Did you understand that, as per 85.2, processes should be in place for landlords and other responsible persons to scrutinise alterations and building work within common parts that could have an effect on fire safety in the block?
Yes.
Yes, and then it goes on, as you might rightly point out, it's important that building regulations approval is obtained where relevant. So can we take it that you knew that the TMO, as the responsible person, in accordance with its obligations under the RRO, had to have a process in place for scrutinising alterations so that you could understand whether they had an effect on fire safety?
Yes, but we had employed a significant number of technical experts with an awful lot more knowledge and experience than me in order to advise us on the detail of the products and the processes and the systems that we were putting in place.
And if you turn to page 130, if you look at the box of examples, it's a lengthy list of bullet points, but if you look at the third from the end, it says this, that a landlord undertaking a project to fit a rain screen cladding to an existing block of flats without considering the potential for a fire from a flat to travel upwards through the cavity behind the cladding to spread into flats above. Now, did you consider that those paragraphs were relevant to your role, particularly as the competent person?
I considered that I did not personally have the skills to do that justice. And I was aware that the project team had specialist consultants and contractors and fire safety strategists and the whole range of experts with significantly more experience and awareness and knowledge than me. And my expectation was that they were in a better position to provide us with the advice that we required and ensure that we were compliant.
Yes, I'm not really sure that answers my question, and I'm not sure I'm asking it in a sharp enough way. Did you satisfy yourself that Claire Williams, as the project manager, knew that the LGA guidance contained these obligations?
Probably not.
No. So who else, other than you, to your knowledge, knew the LGA as well as you?
I didn't, because I wasn't on the project team, then I didn't know the specific knowledge and experience of the individuals working on the project, but I knew that we had specialists in all the relevant areas, and I would assume that therefore meant people who understood fire safety in blocks of flats. But I can't answer you specifically because I wasn't dealing with those individuals.
I understand that, and that again doesn't quite meet my point. The question is one of responsibility as the responsible person for making sure that this obligation was discharged as the responsible person. So my question is, other than you, who was it within the TMO who knew that there had to be that a landlord undertaking a project to fit rain screen cladding to existing block of flats had to consider the potential for a fire from a flat to travel upwards, etc.? Who was it in the TMO other than you who knew that this policy existed, this guidance existed?
I don't know. I don't know whether
No.
Peter Madison knew or Claire knew.
No.
But what I would say is this is captured in the LGA guide, but this isn't the only place that this requirement is known to people who are responsible for installing cladding to a compliant standard, liaising with building control. That this isn't the only place that this obviously needs to happen.
No, indeed. But Claire Williams wasn't the competent person, was she?
No.
No, and Claire Williams, as far as you know, wasn't instructed to go and read up on the LGA guide and make sure that the project complied not only with the contractual obligations but also the statutory obligations under the RRO. Or am I wrong about that?
I don't know, because I wasn't part of, my frustration is I wasn't part of the project team, so I don't know the specifics of all of the different experts and their areas of responsibility and the level of experience they had. I'm confident that they would have had the skills and the knowledge and the understanding to be aware of this and to be aware of where it states something equivalent in building regulations and other standards, but I wasn't part of that team, so I can't directly answer your question.
So, no, but you, I think maybe, nearly have. The only remaining question is, who was the health and safety professional sitting within the project team who could have picked up the LGA guide in the one hand, known the TMO's obligations under it, and made sure they were discharged, particularly by reference to cladding?
And I don't know the answer to that because I wasn't part of the project team or the recruitment of the project team or the drawing up of the tender or any of those things. So I'm afraid I'm not able to answer that.
Now, then, moving to the October 2014 Grenfell FRA, can we just go to that? CST 403177. Go to page 10 in it. We needn't look at the first page. We now know the date. It's 17th of October 2014. Page 10, this is the action plan for that FRA. And if you look at item... well, it hasn't got an item. Sorry. No item number, but priority is high. And the identified risk or hazard is, external face of this building is to be overclad. The piece of cladding fixed to the external wall at the moment is on timber battens. Actions to be taken. I would recommend that the contractor provides, 1, the scope of works covering how this cladding, ? How will the cladding be fixed to the building? What fixings will be used? 2. 3, the fire rating of the cladding and fixings. 4, the building control officer's acceptance of this fixing system and the cladding used. Now, that action, as I've shown you, had a red or high priority rating. That meant, didn't it, that it was due to be actioned in accordance with your understanding within 2 to 3 weeks, yes?
Yes.
And do you remember seeing that action point?
Yes.
Yes. And when you saw that action point about the cladding, was it something that you were expecting Carl Stokes to opine on, or was it something that you thought might have come from left field, as it were?
No, I think it was valid for him to ask. I'm confident it would have been allocated to Claire Williams because the information would have had to come from the project team.
Right. Now, actioning the recommendation, it means simply no more than asking the contractor to provide answers to the 4 questions, yes?
Yeah, and to get, building controls input, where they're at with it, what their views are, if they've approved it. Or
You are right. Answers to the 3 questions and to get building control acceptance.
yes.
Yes. Did you pursue that with the contractor?
I wouldn't have, Claire would have.
Right. So did you hand that action to Claire and say, you've got 2 to 3 weeks to get on with it?
Yes.
You did you?
Yes, it would have been allocated through a W2 system by then, and she would have, it's high, so it had predetermined priority.
And would she have understood the action timing to be the same as you, namely it had to be done within 2 to 3 weeks, not just started within 2 to 3 weeks?
Yeah, it's allocated by the system. Yeah.
Right, I see. So we're not on the Stokes understanding of actioning, we're in the TMO understanding of actioning. Yes. Now, let's go to your first witness statement, please. I want to ask you about what you say there at page 15, paragraphs 68 to 69. You say there, at 68, the only time I recall having to consider the nature of the cladding on Grenfell Tower was following the fire that occurred on 19th of August 2016 at Shepherd Court. 8 months later, on 6th of April 2017, the LFB sent a letter to Laura Johnson highlighting that testing of the panels had found that the combustibility of the composition of the panels at Shepherd's Court did not meet the levels expected for conformity with the building regulations, the new exhibit. Laura Johnson forwarded this letter to Robert Black and myself. I then forwarded it to various TMO staff for their attention. You exhibit that. Are you telling us here that this was the only time you were asked to consider the cladding on Grenfell Tower specifically?
Other than the instance that you just referred to, which I'd obviously forgotten when I drafted this witness statement.
Right.
Yes.
Now, you refer to the letter there in paragraph 69, the 6th of April 2017 letter. Let's look at that. That is at RBK 3026888. It's a letter we looked at closely with Laura Johnson when she gave evidence. Let's look at it again now. It came in to the TMO. It came into RBKC from LFB on the 6th of April 2017 from Hannah Lauer of the LFB. And it then made its way up the chain on the 19th of April 2017, after a gap because I think Miss Johnson was away on holiday. And it starts, tall buildings, external fire spread, and refers in the first paragraph to Shepherd's Court. And in the third paragraph it says, we've seen a number of cases where it appears on the basis of the information available to us that the level of fire protection to the external face of the building did not comply with the requirements of Part B of the building regulations, insofar as they seek to limit the speed with which a fire can travel and spread over the external face of a building or may contribute to a fire. Testing of panels has found that the combustibility of the composition of the panels at Shepherd's Court did not meet the levels expected for conformity with the building regulations. On testing, it was found the panels may deform or delaminate, exposing any combustible core or constituent material, resulting in the panel becoming involved in the fire and allowing the fire to spread and enter flats other than the flat of origin of the fire. And then, if you look at the very foot of the page, if we can scroll down to that, in the penultimate line it says, contracts for the provision and installation of replacement elements of the building facades, including insulation, replacement double glazing, and associated spandrel and infill panels, must ensure compliance with all, in bold and underlined, parts of Part B if they are to secure public safety and minimise fire losses. And then the last paragraph. I would therefore strongly urge that you consider this issue as part of the risk assessment process for premises under your control. I suggest that you make sure all relevant information about any replacement window and facade schemes is fully available to fire risk assessors. Where no reliable information is available for a given property, it is our general expectation that a strategy to assess the risk and, where necessary, implement short, medium and long-term actions to address the risk. This assessment will need to take account of other fire safety measures already in place in the building, as well as potential mitigation measures to ensure that any potential fire spread does not pose a risk to health and safety. Now, I've read that to you almost in full. We know you got it at the time. First of all, did the technical requirements in respect of facades, insulation, replacement double glazing, and spandrel and infill panels mean anything to you?
A bit.
A bit. Not much.
The spandrel panels, so my recollection is that shortly after this fire, Carl went to the building and got as close to it as he could to do his own inspection. So he mentioned to me that it looked like these were spandrel panels and that's how the fire had propagated. So I wasn't surprised to receive something specifically in relation to Shepherd's Court. Yes, sorry. But
as you say, not much. Well, let's look on. TMO 100166000, which is your Exhibit 19. We see how this came to you and what you did with it.
Yeah.
You get this from Laura Johnson, as we can see on the 19th, bottom of your screen.
Yeah.
Because it comes to Robert Black and you, okay? Simply FYI, yes?
Yes.
And then if we look up the screen, we can see what you do. You forward this on to Peter Madison, Julie Selhep, Alex Bosman, Anthony Cheney, and others.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, or FYI, please see the letter attached from the LFB regarding external cladding and glazing. Why did you forward this to other TMO staff in this chain and staff at Repairs Direct, did you think?
I sent it to all of the senior technical managers. So Peter Madison was the director for asset and regeneration. Alex Bosman, Anthony Cheney were his direct reports. Graham Webb was obviously, he was in charge of all of the responsive repairs at that time. Derek Singleton was the responsive repairs manager, reported to Graham Webb. Samuel Hart also was a manager in Repairs Direct, and Shannon McInnes was the health and safety manager in Repairs Direct. So I was trying to make sure all of the senior technical managers and health and safety colleague were aware. I copied it to Barbara, so she was familiar, and my colleague Adrian Bowman, so that everybody could see it and everybody could see what the fire brigade were asking.
Now, if we go to your first witness statement at paragraph 70, you say there, this is page 15, following receipt of this letter, I checked with Carl Stokes whether the new cladding panels fitted to Grenfell Tower complied with the requirements for the building regulations. And if you go on to page 49 in the same statement, paragraph 227, you say there, to address our concerns about the contents of this letter, I contacted our fire risk assessor, Carl Stokes, and sought confirmation that we did not have any blocks with cladding of the nature described in the LFB's letter. In particular, I was concerned about Grenfell Tower, which had recently some external cladding panels fitted during the refurbishment. Carl advised me that he'd investigated thoroughly the details of the installation of Grenfell Tower with Ryden on site and had been advised that these complied with the requirements of the building regulations. Robert then sent this information to Laura Johnson, stating that it might be useful to update the scrutiny committee. Now, you say at the end of the page before, if we just look at that, go back, that you were concerned about Grenfell Tower, which had recently some external cladding panels fitted during the refurbishment. Why were you concerned about the panels at Grenfell Tower particularly?
I wasn't particularly, but the letter was talking about external panels and flame spread. So in the first instance, I was concerned about whether we had any buildings with spandrel panels, because that was what had caused the problem at Shepherd's Court. So I was trying to identify any blocks where we had spandrel panels, but obviously Grenfell Tower was on my radar because we've got virtually no blocks with cladding, and it was kind of it was obvious that I just needed to what I thought was double check that everything had gone through the required approvals process.
So the letter prompted you to think about Grenfell, even though it was related to spandrel panels.
Well, it's external spread, so it seemed appropriate.
Yes, I'm not disagreeing with you at all, but I'm
sorry.
trying to understand your thinking. Now, apart from Carl Stokes, did you email anybody else to check whether the new cladding panels installed at Grenfell complied with the requirements of the building regulations?
As you saw, I copied it to all of those people. I didn't specifically, I mean, it was quite clear what the fire brigade were asking, so I didn't think there was any value in me reiterating in an email what the fire brigade were asking. And then I copied it to Carl as well. I don't think any of my other colleagues responded.
No. Well, were you expecting a response from them?
Well, I thought they might have been at least curious, or how can we move this forward? How can we make sure that we get the right information and give it to the risk assessor? I thought there was a conversation to be had about how we would move forward.
You wouldn't expect any of them to tell you whether or not they complied with the building regulations, would you?
No, that wasn't what I meant. No.
No.
There were sort of two aspects to it, really. I was thinking.
Yes, I mean, to be clear, you didn't email anybody else or contact anybody else to check whether the new cladding panels, about which you were particularly concerned, as you say, at Grenfell Tower, complied with the building regulations.
No, but I had written to Peter Madison, who was ultimately the technical director for the project. So I don't think it would be unreasonable to expect him to raise any concerns or issues or anything that we hadn't met.
And why did you email Carl Stokes?
Well, partly because he, as you know, had been doing assessments on our properties for a period of years and knew the properties quite well, and knows spandrel panels quite well. Hadn't identified any that I was aware of, but I wondered if there were. It was sort of a double check, really, just to get his view on was there anything that we hadn't previously identified and we should investigate further. And yeah, that really.
What did you understand to be Carl Stokes' qualifications in respect of advising on external cladding panels in the context of this letter?
As I say, he went to Shepherd's Court, so he was clear. I mean, he recognised spandrel panels. He knew about those. He knew what they looked like. He knew what he was looking out for. He'd been there shortly after the fire, so he was very clear, and he was familiar with our property. So he certainly would recognise any spandrel panels and would have been able to, or if he had any that he had doubts about, he could have flagged them up, and then we could have looked to find a consultant or a contractor to go and do further investigations. So I was looking for him to highlight anything that he thought would potentially require more investigation.
That's not quite what you say in your statement. You say you checked with him to see whether the new cladding panels fitted to Grenfell complied with the requirements of the building regulations. That's not the same thing as identifying any buildings in the TMA stock that might happen to have spandrel panels, is it?
Well, it's both, because the letter's kind of asking for both. I probably haven't captured it very well in my statement.
But focusing on what you say you were after, which was his advice as to whether the new cladding panels fitted to Grenfell Tower complied with the requirements of the building regulations, what did you understand was Carl Stokes' qualifications in respect of advising on that?
It was really to do with the discussions and the reassurance that he had from Rydens, and as he put things into his action plan and significant findings, as we were given documentation to address these, I'd been forwarding these items to Carl and asking if he was happy with what they were providing, if he felt that complied. So he'd done that sort of desktop exercise based on the documentation. So I was looking for reassurance based on the conversations and the sight of the documentation provided by Rydens.
Right, so you were asking Carl Stokes really for what he'd been told by and given by Rydens rather than any professional opinion.
Well, yes, because he wasn't part of the contracts team.
No, well, you see, that's why I'm asking. You see, in your statement, as I showed you at paragraph 70, you say, I checked with Carl whether the new cladding panels fitted to Grenfell Tower complied with the requirements for the building regulations. Were you asking him simply for what he'd been told by Rydens, or were you asking him for his professional opinion about whether the cladding panels did comply?
I was asking him, on the basis of the documentation that we had been provided with, if it was his understanding that they complied with the building regulations.
What did you understand to be his qualification to to express an opinion about that matter?
My understanding was that if it had the appropriate building regulations approval, that's what we would be expecting. And he would have seen enough building regulations approvals in his time that hopefully he could have.
Well, that's something you could do, isn't it? I mean, sorry, I'm muddled by that. If you're asking him what was, on the basis of the documents that he'd seen, whether it was his understanding that the panels complied with the building regulations, what qualifications do you think he had to be able to offer that opinion to you?
He's my fire risk assessor, so he's my kind of fire consultant and the only person that I've got recourse to. So I haven't got recourse to anyone who was on the project team. So I'm asking him on the basis of the documentation that he's got and the discussions that he's had with the contractor and any other information that he may have, whether he considered it complied.
Whether he considered it complied?
Well,
I mean, let me be clear. You could do one of two things. You could say, Carl, will you go and collate all the information you've given me?
yes,
And summarise the views you've been given about compliance?
yes.
Or you could say, look at what you've been given and offer me your professional opinion. Which was it?
Which was it? Sorry. Run that by me again. Apologies.
Well, you could either ask him for a summary of what he'd read in the material he'd been given,
Yeah.
which is what you could do, but it would be more convenient for him to do it. Or you could ask him for his professional opinion about compliance. Which were you asking him for?
I was asking him based on the documentation that he had and the discussions that he'd had with people involved in the contract and the building control, people who he may or may not have bumped into on site, whether the building complied.
So you are asking him for his professional opinion based on that material about compliance?
Well, yes.
Yes. And what qualifications did you think he had to offer an opinion about the compliance with the building regulations?
Well, I'm not really sure how to answer that. I mean, sorry, I'm not really sure how to answer that. He would have been, we were basically, I suppose I was basically asking him if it complied with the building regulations, and he had previously assessed, I'm imagining, a number of building regulations, documentations, and understood a lot more about the building regulations than I did, so I believed he was qualified to provide that.
Now, we know that he included details about the cladding in his FRA of the 20th of June 2016. Let's look at that. CST 403145, and we'll find that at page 4. On page 4, you can see at the very top of the page, it says this: new external cladding has been fitted to this building as part of the project of refurbishment / construction work being undertaken on and within this building. The original external face of this building has been overclad. The new fire-rated cladding is fixed to the out face of the building by metal fixings, and the whole process has been overseen by the RBKC Building Control Department and officers. They have approved and accepted the fixing system and cladding used. Did you read that passage?
Yes,
Did you pay attention to it?
I believe I did, yes.
Yes. What did you understand by it?
I understood that he had been in discussions with Rydens and Claire and the other professionals dealing with the project, and he had sought documentation, including the building regulations approval, but other documents, and based on that, he'd interpreted that as approval was given, and therefore it met the requirements at the time.
Yes. I mean, most of these are observations, so to that extent I understand your answer. Let me just see if I can focus a bit more. When he says new fire-rated cladding is fixed to the outer face of the building, what did you understand he meant by that?
I understood that the cladding that had been fixed to the outer face of the building would have had the required certification to ensure that it was appropriate to that location and provided the degree of fire retardance.
Was it your understanding that Carl Stokes had himself assessed the external cladding for whether it had complied with the building regulations and himself come to the view that it did, or, as he put it, it was fire rated?
The latter, I believe. I mean, he will have assessed any documentation that was provided to him, but that doesn't alter the fact that the project team leading the project have that remit, and Carl's continuing to do his fire risk assessment, but the responsibility sat with the project team.
Right, I think it's the latter, which I'm not quite sure I understand. Let me just see if I can understand it. When he says here that the new fire-rated cladding is fixed to the outer face of the building, was it your understanding that Carl Stokes had himself assessed the external cladding and concluded that it complied with the building regulations?
I'm not sure how much documentation he had, so I'm not sure he'd have been in a position to do his own independent assessment. But he certainly would have had copies of the building regulations approval, which would have given him assurance.
Yes, you see, what I'm really seeking to understand is whether, when you read this, you thought he was simply passing on something he'd been told without applying his mind to whether it was right or wrong, or whether he was offering his own opinion on the basis of what he'd been given. What did you understand?
I think possibly a mixture of both, although I still maintain that the responsibility sat with the project team and all of their experts. So he was raising an issue, noting that there was cladding on the outside of the building, knowing that can be problematic, getting as much documentation as he can to confirm the details of the cladding and the approvals, and then just passing that on to me. So he's not doing a thorough desktop of all of the cladding and the insulation and all of those things, and I don't think that's his responsibility too either.
Just tell me with this, did you understand that Carl Stokes was providing you with some assurance over and above that which you would have got from the project team or the building control officers?
Probably not over and above, actually. Probably just confirming that the due process had been followed and that the building regs had been complied with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all right, thank you.
But in order to you say probably just confirming, but isn't it right that in order to offer that confirmation that the due process has been followed and the building regulations have been complied with, he had to satisfy himself that was the case, independently?
I don't think he would have had access to all of the documentation in order to make that judgment.
Did you think that at the time?
I knew how difficult it was to get the documentation we were requesting, and that's why some of the FRA actions took so long to close down. So I don't think it would have all been forthcoming.
Did it not occur to you at the time, if that was your thinking, that Carl Stokes had absolutely no business to be offering what looks like an opinion of his own on whether or not the cladding adhered to the building regulations?
But if building control are saying it complies with the building regulations, he's passing that information on, isn't he?
Well, he could simply have said that the cladding has been passed by building control. But what would be the point of that? And indeed, the question is, I've got for you, is what is the point? What did you understand to be the point of any of this?
I think he thinks it's his responsibility to flag up anything, any material changes, whether they be externally in the building or in the building, and he was probably trying to offer some reassurance that the whole thing had gone through the building control department and approvals seemed to be in place.
Had you ever asked Mr. Stokes for his advice on the compliance of the cladding panels at any time before 2017?
No, I don't believe.
Sorry, 2016, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I don't believe I did.
No. And that being so, why did you think it appropriate to ask him for his view in April 2017 on receipt of the LFB letter of the 6th of April?
I can't really answer that other than he's the assessor. He knows our buildings better than most people. And in retrospect, I should have gone through Claire and all the way back through the design team, the project team. But at the time, I can't really tell you. Just he seemed, and you had some familiarity with it, and knew that he would have read all the documentation that he'd been provided with. I was confident would be clear that where building regs requirements were around, that he would have gone to the best of his knowledge to ensure that they'd been adhered to and complied with.
Now, the letter from Dan Daly, as we saw, said in the second paragraph that you should make sure that all relevant information about replacement window and facade schemes was fully available to fire risk assessors.
Yeah.
When you asked Carl Stokes for his advice on the letter, did you make sure, well, let me ask you, did you take steps to make sure that he had all of the relevant information about the replacement windows and the facade scheme for Grenfell?
No, not at that time.
Why is that?
Well, as I said previously, that was part of the reason for passing on, apart from just increasing the awareness of the letter, was also to get my colleagues in the technical teams to start thinking about how that could practically be managed. How would we be able to extract the documentation that we required to pass it through to the assessor as he continues doing his assessments.
Did you take any steps to identify each piece of information, or document, guidance, certificates that Carl Stokes was given by Ryden so that he could give you the opinion you were after?
We had the significant findings. We had what he was asking for. We knew so I could have gone back to that and identified what had been passed to him. He didn't ask me for anything additional before he gave me his view. If he had, I would have pursued that.
Well, do you know what? Can you sit there today and tell me what he had?
No, not without going back to the significant findings, no.
No, but do you remember applying your mind to making sure that Carl Stokes had in front of him all the documents that you might reasonably think he needed in order to be able to express the opinion you were asking him for?
I know that I'm confident that when we got the significant findings in the June, as and when the documentation came through from Ryden's particularly, I would have sent each of them to him saying, this is what I've been given to respond to 19D or whatever. Is this what you're asking for? Is this good enough? Are there any issues? Do I need to chase for a further version? So effectively, is it okay to complete this action? Has this been complied with? So I knew that as all of that had come through, I would have been passing it to him, and I wouldn't have closed down the action unless he confirmed. As I sit here now, without going through and doing that piece of legwork, I can't tell you for sure what I am.
You see, we haven't seen any communication from you to anybody in the project team, or Ryden for that matter, to say, please will you give Mr. Stokes all the technical data that you've got on the rain screen materials, the insulation, the infill panels and the fixings, so that he can make an assessment of his own about whether they comply with the building regulations.
Yeah, and I didn't do that.
No.
I didn't do that partly because they had their own fire specialists and they had all of their experts, and also because I almost only knew anecdotally initially that there was cladding involved. So they had their specialist team that were getting on and doing rigorously, and I'm sat somewhere else trying to keep other things going. So no, I didn't do that.
No,
But I thought it was being done, and I thought we'd appointed people who had all of the right skills in order to do it.
If you thought, and if you understood that the project team had a specialist fire consultant, did you think it might be worth bringing this letter to the attention of the consultant and perhaps asking that consultant whether he had any comments about it?
I could have done. I mean, by then the contract's over sort of nearly 12 months, and perhaps I just didn't think about it. Yeah, and that's a possibility.
Well, I raise it because it might have occurred to you that a proper fire consultant might have had rather more to offer than Mr. Stokes in relation to those sort of technical questions.
Yeah, no, you're right. I suppose perhaps I was a bit naive in that because there were all of those people involved in the project, I thought that it would have stalled more than it did, because if the information and the approvals weren't coming, then it would have had to be redesigned or reconfigured. And I wanted to believe that none of those people would let it get to its conclusion unless it was all done entirely as it should have.
Thank you.
Okay.
Now, can we go to CST 403112, please, which is your email of the 24th of April 2017 to Carl Stokes. CST 403112. Mr. Chairman, I embarked on this document, but then spotted the time. I'm in your hands as to whether we cover
Well,
it.
how long do you expect to take with it?
On this topic, longer than would take us to the useful.
Oh, is this the start of a new topic?
Well, it's not. No, it isn't the end or the beginning of the end, but it might be the end of the beginning, so to speak. It won't take us. Tea might be better taken now.
Well, that's a much better way of putting it. All right, well, we'll take tea now then. These clocks are all showing something different. I'm assuming Mr. Millett's looking at the one on the far wall. So we'll stop now and we'll have a break until 25 to 4, please.
Yes, we have an information asymmetry.
Yeah. All right, 25 to 4, please. And no talking to anyone about your evidence over the break, please. Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Millet, I'd really quite like to finish the witness today, if that's reasonably possible. What do you think?
I don't think it's reasonably possible.
It's not.
I don't think it is. I'll look at the questions over the break and see if we can see how we might be able to make them a little bit more pointed. But there's a bit of material to cover. But if we go into tomorrow, which I think we will, because I know there are further questions coming in from beyond, we will not be at all long. Yeah. I'm afraid we will have to detain the witness overnight. It's inevitable.
All right. Yep. Thank you very much. 25 to 4, please. Yes, would you ask Mrs. Wray to come back in, please? Right, you okay? Right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
Mr. Willett.
Ms. Wray, can we please go to CST 403112? Now, this is the email which you sent Carl Stokes on the 24th of April.
Yes.
If you go, please, to page 1, very bottom of the page, you say, I don't think you can quite, yes, there it is. And this is you to him, 24th of April at 9:34. Carl, my understanding is that we do not have any blocks with external cladding of this nature. Are you able to confirm, please? I need to write back to the Director of Housing, and I think you are probably best placed to advise me on the construction of our blocks. And you can see the subject matter there is the letter from the LFB, and it's being forwarded on to him.
Yes.
Now, you said before that you had no involvement or knowledge of the cladding used in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower. But here you say, my understanding is that we do not have any blocks with external cladding of this nature. Would that include the cladding on Grenfell Tower?
I was referring to the spandrel panels at this point.
I see.
And it was my understanding that we didn't have any of those, but I think, as I said before, Carl had visited Shepherd's Court, and I think we'd already had some discussions shortly after the fire about what the impact potentially was on our stock.
Right. So when you say of this nature, do you mean spandrel panels?
Yes, I do.
What made you think then of Grenfell Tower, or was it the fact that Grenfell Tower also had spandrel panels on it?
I think.
Or might have.
I think that's what I was referring to. I'm confident I was referring to spandrel panels, but I can see that Carl's response is Grenfell was clad, but the cladding, so he's making it wider then at that point.
Well, what made you think that the recently clad Grenfell Tower did not have relevant cladding on it, such as to make it fall into the category of none?
So again, I was asking about spandrel panels. My understanding is that we do not have any blocks with external cladding of this nature. So external cladding in terms of spandrel panels. Are you able to confirm, please? And then he's come back and said Grenfell was clad, but cladding complied with the requirements of building regulations. Lots of questions asked of Rydens and answers received back. I probably, in between that, I may well have also had. I might have had a phone call with him as well, just to further clarify.
Well, I was going to ask you, at what point in this email chain did you ask him the question we saw you refer to in your statement about whether or not the cladding complied with the building regulations?
I can't recall. I mean, he would often, when I forwarded emails to him, he would often ring me if he was out on site in order to clarify or just to speak more about it. So it's likely that happened, but I can't remember.
Do you mind my asking you to clarify? Do you recall now what you understood then by the term a spandrel panel?
I wouldn't be able to define it, but I would know visually what one looked like, in that they look like they're sort of a concrete surface, but there's a different lining within, because Shepherd's Court is on Shepherd's Bush, and I go to Westfields quite a lot, so I had looked at the building and I think I had some photographs. So I knew what I was meaning by it, but I wouldn't have been able to define the constituent parts.
I mean, did you understand it to be to refer to a location or a material or what?
A material. The panels usually just sat below the windows. They almost looked not quite pebble dash. They had a kind of visual appearance that I was familiar with, so I knew what they were referring to.
Yep. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, thank you. Now, we can, as you mentioned, Carl Stokes' response 3 hours or so later on the same day, and you've just read it out. I don't need to do it again. Your reply was on the 26th of April, at the top of page 1, thanks, got it now, it was in spam. Now, when you received his email, which you've referred to, Grenfell was clad, but the cladding complied with the requirements of the building regulations. Did you know what questions he had asked of Rydens?
I probably did at the time, and I would have been able to refer back to the significant findings and action plans, which would have had some of them. Again, I think that's probably something we discussed on the phone, but I didn't put in writing.
Did you know whom he had asked?
No, I don't. I mean, when he went to site, he would communicate with, I used to get the Simons mixed up, either Simon Lawrence or Simon O'Connor. He would often report in to the site agent to let them know that he was in the vicinity. So he would ask questions, whoever was sort of in charge locally at the time, but then also via the significant findings through Claire, we addressed those to whoever was appropriate at Rydens.
Did you know the extent of any investigations he had done to assess the compliance of the cladding with the building regulations, as he says here?
No, I didn't know the extent, no.
Did you not think that this was such a sweeping and unspecific response that it deserved a follow-up from you asking the questions I've just asked you? What did you ask? Who did you ask? What answers did you get? And what investigations did you yourself conduct?
Yeah, it did. And I don't know why I didn't spend more time doing that. I would say that because the project had its own specialist team with all sorts of consultants and engineers and fire safety people, that I had always been led to believe that all of that was being conducted within the project team. So it was almost looking for a kind of belt and braces approach. But I didn't follow up, and I should have done.
When you say a belt and braces approach, what was the belt, if this is the braces?
Well,
who else were you, by which I mean, who else were you asking?
Well, the information that we're getting from the project team via building control or all of the information that we have requested and has been assessed by the project team, so that when the project is concluded, I naturally assumed that everything was as it should be. Everything was complied with, everything was specified appropriately, because that's why we had the specialists that we had. We had clerks of works, we had all sorts of people then looking at the how it was put together. So there's the issue about what was specified, the issue about the construction, and then there's the sign-off for building control. So all of those people were contributing to my overall picture of, yes, this has been done the way that it should.
Well, if it's a belt, it's a very thin one, because I mean, this was, as I say, would you accept, such a sweeping and unspecific response that it couldn't reasonably be relied on by you in order to go back to the Director of Housing and give her a fully informed answer?
You're right, it wasn't a fully informed answer.
So why were you content with this?
It was an initial response. I was expecting to go back to the technical managers and ask loads more questions, particularly about how we were going to do the rest of it, how we were going to extract the information in order for the assessor to do his ongoing assessment of blocks where we had other major works, which had either recently been completed or were proposed. But at this stage, I responded as I did.
You say you were expecting to go back to the technical managers and ask loads more questions. Did you? We see no evidence of it.
I think that I did start off the process by speaking to some of my colleagues, likely to have been in David Gibson's team, but I didn't put anything in writing, and it was going to be... but also, it would have involved speaking to John Parsons, who had information in Keystone. It wasn't going to be a quick fix, and I knew that. So I had sort of started that process off at that stage.
You say this was the start of the process. Help me with this. I'm not sure we've seen any documents that show that the process went any further than this.
Well, not at this stage. No, it didn't, because...
Well, at what stage did it?
So we have our letter. They're very clear what they want us to adopt going forward. I sent a copy to all the technical people with responsibility and access to the information, and then I was going to follow that up with discussions with each of those managers and then refine how we can put that together. And no, I didn't put it in writing because at that stage I was trying to get their buy-in initially so that I could see what was going to be the most effective way of taking it forward.
You see, your question to Carl Stokes is about whether there are any blocks with spandrel panels in your stock.
Yeah.
Now, leave aside whether that's the right question or not. His answer is about Grenfell specific. He says, as far as I know, that is correct. So he's answered your question. Then he's come back with something else. He says, Grenfell was clad, but the cladding complied with the requirements of the building regulations. Lots of questions asked of Riders and answers received back from them. Now, Carl Stokes obviously saw Grenfell as deserving of particular treatment. My question is, what did you do to investigate his investigation of that at any stage?
I did not do anything to investigate his investigation of the work that the design team and the contract team specialists were doing.
And my question again, why were you content with his bald assurance about Grenfell, given that he'd come up with it, rather than asking him for some specifics about how he had arrived at what he's telling you there?
Well, I think it's obvious that I could have spent more time on this, but I didn't at the time. I understood that the project team had all the specialists in place. So I, in good faith, believed that they had everything that needed to be in place to specify, to construct, to have sign off. My understanding was building control had signed off the building, so I thought what he was telling me seemed to accord with what my expectations would be for all of those specialists running a complicated project.
That was an assumption on your part, wasn't it?
Yes.
So you didn't take any steps, just to be clear, as a matter of fact, you didn't take any steps to make sure that the project team put this letter from the LFB into the hands of the specialist fire engineers.
No, I didn't, but I sent it to Peter Madison, who was ultimately responsible for that project, and he would have, if he'd read it, he may well have decided to do that himself.
Now, you've exhibited JW20, which is your email to Robert Black and Barbara Matthews of the next day, 27th of April, TMO 10016666, page 2. And you say there, "Hi, Robert. Apologies for the delay, but I wanted to check with our fire risk assessor before I responded to you. I can confirm that it is our understanding that we do not have any blocks with cladding of the nature described in the LFB's letter, which was present at the Shepherd's Bush Tower block. Grenfell Tower did have external cladding panels fitted as part of the recent refurbishment work, however. Our assessor investigated thoroughly the details of the installation with the contractor, Rydens, when the works were on site, and he's able to confirm that this complies with the requirements of the current building regulations." Now, would you agree that you are here expressly providing reassurance to Robert Black and Barbara Matthews that the issues raised by Dan Daly in the external fire spread letter were not of a concern with regard to the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project?
I'm advising them that our assessor investigated thoroughly with Rydens the details of the installation and that it has building regulations approval. So, yes.
And you're advising them that this needed no further investigation, in effect? Yes?
I don't think I'm explicitly stating that.
Implicitly, though.
Maybe implicitly.
Now, if you didn't know, as I think you confirmed before, the extent of Carl Stokes' investigations to assess the cladding, why did you tell Robert Black and Barbara Matthews that Carl Stokes had investigated thoroughly, your words,
Yep.
the details of the installation with Rydens?
I knew that he had had extensive conversations with Rydens. Carl's a man who asks a lot of questions. So when he was on site, he would have asked quite a lot, not just about the fixings, but about all sorts of aspects of the project. And what he didn't find answers to, he would put in the significant findings. So my understanding was at that stage, he had asked all of the questions that he felt were appropriate, and he was content with the responses and with the approvals.
But you
given.
didn't actually know what he'd actually done by way of actual investigation, did you?
No, we established that, but I hadn't asked him specific questions.
No. So you had no basis, did you, on which to represent to Robert Black or Barbara Matthews that Mr. Stokes had investigated thoroughly?
I didn't have the details, but I was absolutely confident that that degree of interrogation would have taken place.
You were confident that your assumption was justified, but you had no empirical basis on which to make that representation as a factual statement. Yes?
I can only reiterate that I knew from having spoken to him that he would have thoroughly investigated with Rydens and asked them lots of questions, which is what he said. I've asked them loads of questions. What I don't know, as we've established, is what specific questions.
Now, can we just go back to the external fire spread letter, please? It's RBK 3026888, page 2. I just want to look with you, if we can, Ms. Ray, the final paragraph in that with you. It says there, I would therefore strongly urge that you consider this issue as part of the risk assessment process for premises under your control. I suggest that you make sure all relevant information about any replacement window and facade schemes is fully available to fire risk assessors. Did you instruct Carl Stokes to consider that issue in the future as part of his fire risk assessment process?
I believe I did, and he certainly had a copy of this letter, so he knew perfectly well that that was our expectation. I believe that I did.
Right. Now, can we then turn to the question of premises information boxes? Can we go, please, to LFB 30032335? This is the bi-monthly meeting minutes of a meeting on the 13th of July 2016, attended by Rebecca Burton for the LFB and you for the TMO. And if we go down to page 3 in that document, we can see the middle of the page, paragraph, paragraph 7. There's a discussion about Grenfell Tower. Further to previous discussions on the LFB's requirement for a premises information box to be installed at Grenfell Tower, arrangements are in place for the documentation required to be available in a secure box in the lobby. The key to the box will be available from a key safe secured by an FB padlock in the bin room. So is it right that you updated Rebecca Burton that arrangements were in place but for the information?
Yes, my recollection is that the fire brigade had, when the construction was still ongoing, had sort of indicated that it would be helpful to have a premises information box. The works were still on site, and as they were nearing conclusion, Claire came up with an alternative because apparently there was already a secure box in the lobby, and so I think she discussed that, the opportunity to use that instead, and the arrangement for keeping the key and letting the fire brigade know with an FB padlock they could always access it. So that's how we ended up with that arrangement, I believe.
What were those arrangements that you were referring to there?
As it says here.
Right. What information was actually in the secure box in the lobby at this point?
I don't actually know, because it was put in place by the project team, and Claire took charge of it. Normally, previously when we'd had premises information box at Trellick and in sheltered schemes, my team had been involved in procuring the boxes and getting it installed and making sure we agreed with the brigade what was in them. But in this case, because the project was in place and because the information they were requesting wasn't stuff I necessarily had access to, for example, AOV information, then Claire led on this.
Why wasn't there a premises information box in the end put in the lobby at Grenfell?
Well, I believe because they already had a secure, what I'm being told was they already had a secure box which they felt fulfilled that purpose.
Right. Did you ever check for yourself that the secure information box had been installed?
No, I didn't.
Did you ever ask anybody to do that for you?
I'm not sure whether I did, to be honest, but I certainly would have asked Claire for reassurance that it was in place and that the information the brigade had asked for was in there.
What did she tell you?
Well, she must have confirmed that it was there, or it was imminently about to be there.
Well, do you actually remember you were asking her and her telling you that?
Yeah, I'm sure we had that conversation.
Well, being confident that you did is not quite the same as actually remembering it. I don't think we've seen anything in your statements or in hers about that.
I believe that I did, but I probably can't evidence it, so
And what was the documentation provided in the secure box?
Again, that will be from what the fire brigade requested and what Claire had provided. I don't know in this case because I didn't lead on this one, otherwise I could tell you.
Now, we know that on the night of the fire, and this has been the subject of evidence earlier on in this inquiry, there were no plans of Grenfell Tower in any box in the lobby or anywhere else in the building that the LFB could access. You may remember that evidence given by Assistant Commissioner Rowe. Can you explain why
No,
that was the case?
I can't, and I can only really refer you back to Claire and to the project team because I wasn't involved in putting any in. I can tell you all about Trellick Tower because I dealt with that, but I didn't on this issue. It was led from the project team.
So you can't help me as to why there was no premises information box or any secure box at Grenfell Tower which contained even the plans of the building so that the fire brigade could access on the night of the Grenfell Tower fire itself?
No, because I would have happily installed a premises information box, but I was advised by the project team that there was already a secure box available that that could store that information.
Now, I'd like to ask you about the LFB and some of their concerns about Carl Stokes. Can we start with your witness statement, number 1, please, at page 31, paragraph 139. You say in the middle of the page there, throughout the entirety of our working relationship, I never had any concerns regarding Carl Stokes' competence. I was aware that he elected not to be on many of the professional registers. However, when I raised this with him, he assured me that he did not feel he would gain anything from these memberships. He nevertheless assured me that he proactively arranged his own continuing professional development. I was aware that Carl regularly attended seminars, legal updates and briefings in fire safety, as he would often provide me with feedback and a summary of the information presented and outline any potential impact it may have on the TMO. And then in paragraph 158, on the top of page 36, you say, in the 4th line, I do not recall the LFB ever making any comments of such significance that we had any reason to doubt the suitability and competency of Carl Stokes or the FRAs prepared by him.
Yeah.
I'm confident that if any issues were raised about the FRAs, we discussed these with Carl Stokes and the recommendations made were always taken on board. I have a question.
Okay.
Do you remember concerns being raised to you, or with you, about Carl Stokes' competence by members of the LFB?
Yes, by Rebecca. And I don't know why I didn't include that in my statement. It blindsided me. Rebecca Burton had raised concerns about the time of the Adair fire. And I recall there were, I think, a couple of specific points. One was that Carl referred to meetings he'd had with senior LFB officials but wasn't able to evidence them, and therefore they shouldn't have been included. And I think the other was about there was a sort of feeling that instead of just sticking to the most appropriate guide for a building, that maybe he referred to two, when really the appropriate thing to do was to choose the most effective guidance and use that as your base.
Right. Well, just to start with, you say that this statement in here shouldn't have been made and it blindsided you. When did you first realise that this statement, paragraph 158, was wrong?
Apologies. I think when I reread it recently, I realised that I had omitted to include the issues that Rebecca and I meant to say at the beginning, and I must have forgotten.
Okay. All right.
Sorry.
Well, I think we might be able to take it quite quickly in light of that. First, can we look at Rebecca Burton's own second witness statement to the inquiry?
Okay.
Because it might shorten matters with her. LFB 3084098, page 9, paragraph 16, bottom of the page, if we can scroll down to that. She refers to the meeting of the 13th of November 2015, which was arranged to discuss the Adair Tower deficiency notice. And if you look at what she says in the 5th line there, she says this: I was very frank and told her that I did not think he, that's Carl Stokes, was providing a good service to the KCTMO, as illustrated by the quality of the FRA for Adair Tower, which was mirrored in the FRA for its sister tower, Hazelwood Tower, which I'd also reviewed following the Adair Tower fire. Do you remember that she raised that issue with you at the meeting?
Yes, I do.
Yes. And you understood it to relate to concerns about Carl Stokes?
Yes, I did.
And do you remember any specific concerns that she raised?
As I say, there was the one issue about reference to meetings with senior LFB officers that weren't evidenced and she felt couldn't be evidenced. And there was the other one about whether he was always using the most appropriate guide or whether he was maybe potentially cherry picking. I think in relation to Adair and Hazelwood, there was also an issue about self-closers. Yeah, and
Right.
there may be others, but those were the issues.
Now, let's go to LFB 403445. This is an email from Rebecca Burton to Spencer Sutcliffe of the 5th of May 2016, where she summarises to him the meeting of the 13th of November 2015 that we've just been looking at in her statement. You can see what she says. She says, "Hi Spencer, see below an update relating to the action plan following the post-fire review on Adair Tower." And then under action plan, meeting arranged with TMO Health and Safety Manager Janice Wray for 13th November to discuss items. Now that was in relation to the meeting which had occurred the previous November, isn't it?
Yes.
Clearly. And then if you look at the bullet points under that, they're in a slightly different text. They're in blue. She says, during the meeting with Janice Wray on 13th November 2015, I discussed the following areas of concern that had arisen following the fire at Adair Tower. First bullet, TMO's approach to reviewing risk assessments and acting on significant findings in a timely manner. Suitability of fire risk assessments, particularly regarding approach to flat front doors and self-closers. Claim within the fire risk assessment that fire safety regulation had agreed self-closing flat front doors are not required. Next bullet, apparent lack of systems in place to prevent the hindrance of access to DRM during maintenance works. Next bullet, fire risk assessments not demonstrating an understanding of the strategy for the building and how persons will be kept safe in the event of fire. It was agreed at this meeting that Janice Wray would consider each of these points and discuss with their fire risk assessor improvements that could be made.
Yes.
Do you remember her raising those specific issues with you?
Yes, I do.
Do you remember agreeing that you would speak to Carl Stokes about the improvements that could be made in each case?
Yes, and I did.
Did you speak to Carl Stokes after the meeting of the 13th of November?
I did.
You did. And was there a note of that meeting?
No, I spoke to him. I thought it was an important meeting to have face-to-face, and I should have kept a note of the meeting. But, yeah, I raised all of the issues that Rebecca had raised. And I think suffice to say that once we had completed the works for the enforcement notices, it required the brigade's approval of the fire risk assessment, the reviewed fire risk assessment, for the works to be signed off, and that was reviewed. So I feel that reflects the fact that he had taken on board the concerns which were raised.
Did you provide an update to Rebecca Burton?
She didn't ask for one, and she would have raised it again. I mean, we were in pretty frequent dialogue about all sorts of things, and I probably, I'm sure I advised her, as it says here, that I would address it, and I feel like I did address it.
Can we go to TMO 1001101, please? This is an email that you sent to Robert Black and Barbara Matthews on the 13th of November 2015 after your meeting with Rebecca Burton on the 13th of November 2015 at 17:52. And it says, Robert, Barbara, Sasha, as you know, I met with Rebecca Burton this morning to seek clarification on the LFB's response to the fire. She advised that there are certain trigger events that cause the LFB to undertake a review following a fire. In the case of Adair, there were two trigger factors. One, fire survival calls. Two, people rescued from balconies. And then halfway down the page, if we scroll down a bit more, please, she goes on to say, or rather you go on to say, Rebecca confirmed that the concern/questions he had were as follows. And then one, were the original windows on the means of escape staircase openable, etc. Two, rising butt hinges. etc. 3, dry rising firefighting main, etc. And if you look through what you say there, we see nothing in there, and indeed on page 2 either, of the concerns that Rebecca Burton had raised about Carl Stokes with you earlier that morning.
Yeah, and you won't do, because this was an update on the position specifically in relation to Adair and the brigade's position on Adair. I spoke to Barbara about them at length, which, as my line manager, that's what I would always do.
Do you mean by that answer that you spoke to Barbara Matthews orally about the concerns that
Yes.
Rebecca Burton had raised with you about Carl Stokes?
Yes, and what I was proposing to do about them.
Right. But you didn't make a record of it.
No,
Why is that?
just time, really. I knew I was dealing with it, and I knew Barbara would hold me to account and ask me for updates, so it was just time, unfortunately.
Right. Can we then go to the bi-monthly meeting of the 5th of January 2016? This is the day before the scrutiny meeting held by RBKC. This is LFB 3032330. Just look at the first page to begin with to identify the document. There it is.
Okay.
We can see who's present. You are present, Rebecca Burton is present, and Claire Williams also present on this occasion. And it says on page 3, if you go to page 3.8, bottom of the page, risk assessments, Rebecca raised her concern that our fire risk assessor sometimes makes statements which are not justified or supported, and that FRA reports need to include justification for statements made. In particular, reference to discussion with senior LFB officers must provide names, dates, and confirmation of outcome or discussions, etc. Also, in relation to Balfour, the FRA needs to be reviewed to clearly demonstrate that the impact of the missing doors in front of the hopper head in the area, etc., etc. And then it goes on, the second line at the top of page 4. Janice agreed to raise these issues with our assessor, but did comment that we have frequently provided copies of FRAs to the LFB in recent years, and until now these have been well received, considered to be comprehensive, and no criticism had been fed back. Do you remember these concerns being raised at this meeting?
Yes, I do.
Did you agree with them?
I think one of them I already mentioned to you in relation to reference to meetings with LFB colleagues that there were no minutes for. So that's probably a fair comment, actually.
Yes. And what was done to did you raise these concerns with Carl Stokes again?
Yes, I did.
You did. So this is the second time you've had to go back to him with complaints made by the LFB about his work.
Yeah.
Did that not concern you? That now the second time that the LFB are picking him up or picking you up on his quality?
It didn't worry me excessively, because as the point I was trying to make is quite a lot of disparate LFB officers over quite a long period have requested and had copies of the fire risk assessments. And in a number of occasions, they would come back and say, this seems to be broadly compliant. So I'm more than happy to address the concerns that have been flagged. And I'm sure that they're legitimate. And I felt that it was something that we could deal with.
So I'm not sure I follow. Rebecca Burton has now had 2 occasions in the previous 12 months to tell you that she didn't think that the work of your fire risk assessor was satisfactory.
Yes.
That's factually correct.
It is.
Did the fact that this is now rearing its head for a second time not concern you?
I think the points she was making were legitimate, and I was going to be able to address them and had already started to address them at that stage. The point I'm making is that over a long period, we'd been regularly providing copies of the fire risk assessments to a range of her predecessors and her team, and issues weren't being escalated.
What does that tell us?
Well, it
Are you saying
tells
that
me
Rebecca-
that. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
It tells me that the fire brigade were receiving copies of our risk assessments for over a long period, a whole range of inspecting officers, and in some cases they would come back and say they were broadly compliant. They weren't coming back and raising issues. So clearly there's an issue now, but my point is there wasn't a sustained history of concerns being flagged.
Yes, and do I take from that you are really telling us that you regarded Rebecca Burton as perhaps exceptional, picking up issues that no one had previously picked up?
No, I'm just making the point that there isn't a whole history here of discontent and complaints that were not dealt with. That wasn't the case. These are raised now, and I'm dealing with them now, but they hadn't been raised previously.
When she raised it with you for the second time on the 5th of January 2016, did you not wonder to yourself why it was that Carl Stokes perhaps was still producing material that was unsatisfactory, you having already taken back to him the discussion that you'd had with Rebecca Burton at the 13th of November 2015 meeting? Okay.
I think that one of the reasons that this was being raised at this meeting so that it would be minuted, so that we would have a formal audit trail. And it was legitimate to read. If she had concerns, it was right and proper that she raise it so that we can deal with them.
Did you tell Barbara Matthews or anybody else at the TMO, or indeed RBKC, that the LFB had raised these concerns about Carl Stokes, indeed for the second time?
I certainly told Barbara Matthews. I think she probably gets copies of the liaison meeting, but I would have spoken to her about them as well.
I see. Now, do you remember that a month later, on the 17th of February 2016, you were copied into an email by Charlie Saul about a complaint made by a gentleman called Martin Dunn?
Yeah.
You do. Let's look at the document. CST 3027221. If we look at page 2, something's gone wrong. CST 000272221. Yes. And if we go to page 2, this is an email from Martin Dunn to Benjamin Scantlebury and Charlie Saul, 17th of February 2016, as you can see. Dear Mr. Scantlebury, thank you for a copy of the KCTO fire risk assessment for the common parts of your residence. Now, Martin Dunn was at Firecare 999.
Yep.
What was that organisation?
So the gentleman who this is directed to was a leaseholder who wanted to install a stair lift in the communal staircase of the building. And I think we had gone through the occupational therapists, and the assessment by our property people was that because it was a communal staircase that led to 2 flats, it would reduce the width. And so we weren't able to agree that it could proceed. Mr. Scantlebury was obviously very keen to proceed with it, so he engaged his own assessor to review the assessment. Sorry.
So who was Martin Dunn at Firecare 999? Was he a fire risk assessor?
Yes, he was.
Right,
and
thank you.
I think we may have interviewed him whenever we were when we were selecting.
Right, now, focusing on the second paragraph, he says, I've copied in your landlord as a matter of urgency, as the fire risk assessment, which was conducted by Carl Stokes on 7th January 2016, is unsuitable and insufficient, as the elementary fire safety deficiencies have not been identified by the fire risk assessor. Mm-hmm. Now, if we go up to page 1 of this email chain, we can see from the same chain that you were chased on the 1st of July 2016 by Raymond Hilton for a response to this. Do you see that at the foot of the screen? Right, Janice, yes. We still have this matter outstanding. It's now an open complaint, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Had you done anything about the complaint in the intervening 6-month period?
Yes. Yes, I would have done.
What?
I would have sent a copy to Carl and got his comments, and I would likely have fed them back to Raymond, but it seems that I didn't. So
right.
I can't remember the detail. I remember the case because it was difficult.
Well, let's look and see what you say. Look up the screen, please, to higher up page 1. You write to Carl Stokes on the 1st of July 2016 and say, see, this has reared its head again, and it seems we need to respond. I've added the comments you made initially on this below, and some of my own, but I'd be grateful if you could take a look and add any additional comments we can include to beef up our response. And he comes back to you the same day and says, Jay, see the attached I've forwarded as a Word document so that you can use whatever you want. Now, you say reared its head again. It looks from that you had already discussed this with Carl Stokes previously.
Yes, and I would have thought I would have responded previously because it was a difficult situation to deal with.
It looks as if you didn't.
It does look like I didn't.
Yes. Were you not concerned by this complaint?
Yes, I was concerned, but there was a kind of bigger picture in terms of what the gentleman wanted to achieve, and so he was going to go out of his way to find people who would disagree or hopefully achieve what he wanted.
Right. Did you raise with Barbara Matthews or anybody else at the TMO more senior to you that a complaint had been raised about Carl Stokes' fire risk assessment by a fellow professional?
I can't recall if I did. I may well have done, but I can't recall.
Right. Can we look at CST 409576? This is an email from Carl Stokes on the 25th of February 2016, so earlier in the year. Carl Stokes, second email down. Carl Stokes says to you, 25th February 2016, Jay, did you mention to Barbara what the ex-Nova woman said about the FRA? I am thinking after the Firecare 999 block's comments, just so she knows that they are okay. Carl, was this in relation to the complaint from Martin Dunn, or was this about something else?
I presume it was a complaint from Martin Dunn, but I don't recollect.
And do you know who the ex-Nova woman was?
Well, I'm thinking it must be Kate Cooney, because that would be at the time that we had engaged Exova, Warrington Fire, to advise us on our required approach to the ventilation changes required by the enforcement notice at Adair and Hazelwood Towers. But I've no idea what he's referring to. I'm assuming it's Kate Cooney.
Right. Do you know what the ex-Nova woman had said about the FRA?
No, sorry. I really have no recollection.
We can see you respond the same day. Hi. Haven't spoken to her since Exova visit. We'll probably brief her early next week, but intend to mention her comment. You needn't worry, she's quite a supporter of you and already thinks Firecare 999 is outrageous and needs to butt out. Jay, so did you raise the complaint with Barbara Matthews the following week, or did you just regard it as a nuisance?
No, I would have briefed her.
What did she say?
Sorry, at this stage I've no idea, but I clearly would have briefed her. She was involved in quite a lot of things we were doing, so I would have made sure she was aware.
Was any action taken by the TMO in respect of Carl Stokes' contract at that point?
No, but Barbara and I were talking about re-procuring, and we were starting to have that debate with procurement people.
Well, yes, indeed. I'm going to come on to that right now, actually. Can we then move to June 2016 and the annual health and safety report? This is at TMO 100244405. This is the annual report for the year 1st of April 2015 to 31st of March 2016. Mm-hmm. As you can see, and this was drafted by you, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Can we go to page 7, please? Look at paragraph 7.9. As you can see there, fire risk assessments, FRAs. Comprehensive fire risk assessments, suitable and sufficient as required by the legislation, are in place for all blocks which are communal areas, and our ongoing review programme continues. These FRAs are undertaken and recorded in line with best practice, PAS 79, and low-level reviews are undertaken between the comprehensive reviews. This is set out in our fire safety policy and strategy document. As required by the programme, 299 comprehensive reviews were completed in this period, and there's a box which states the same thing. Mm-hmm. Now, there's no mention here, or as far as we can see anywhere else in this report, of the concerns raised by Rebecca Burton twice in that year, mm-hmm. or Martin Dunn.
There isn't.
There is not. Why is that?
I can't give you an explanation.
There should have been, shouldn't there?
Yes. Well, I mean, I've raised it with my line manager, who's the executive director with health and safety responsibility, and we've taken action. So I suppose I thought I've acted upon this, and I think I've dealt with it. So I didn't think to raise it. It must be an oversight on my part.
Well, it's quite a big oversight, isn't it? It's not just an accidental thing that's happened. You've had 3 warnings, 2 from the LFB themselves and 1 from a fellow professional. Are you able to explain how that oversight came about?
Well, but I've taken action. I haven't ignored them. I've addressed them.
No, sorry, the oversight not in relation to you dealing with them, but in relation to you reporting them.
No, I can't give you any other explanation. I'm sorry.
No. This document, just would you remind me, please, where this would have gone? It would have gone presumably to the executive team.
Yes, and
the board?
I think it went to board. It may have gone to one of their other committees at board level, but I thought it went to board.
Yes.
And it would have gone to the corporate health and safety manager at RBKC.
Indeed.
And anybody else who wanted it.
Indeed. So unless you had put into this document the fact that 2 third parties had separately expressed concerns about the quality of your fire risk assessor's work, those third parties, the boards of TMO and RBKC, would not have any idea that had happened, would they?
No, Barbara knew, and she possibly discussed it with Robert, so the executive team would have had some oversight, but no.
No. Now, if we go on in the document to page 18, you can see there, halfway down the page, there's a paragraph 15.2, fire safety. KCTMO gives fire safety a high level of priority, and the commitment goes beyond the need to be compliant. In particular, KCTMO has developed a good working relationship with the LFB, which is mutually beneficial, etc., etc. And then in the middle of that section of text, you say, under the bullet points, additionally, we will be reprocuring fire consultancy and fire risk assessment services. Now, did that mean that you would be reprocuring Carl Stokes' position?
That was the intention, I believe, at that point. I had raised with Barbara that we hadn't done any procurement for a while, but we also needed to be mindful of the additional services that he was undertaking for us. And so I believe her view was that I should go ahead and start speaking to our procurement people. And I've certainly seen some emails between myself and my colleague Ernest Raw, where we'd identified the list of services we were going to require. So that sort of got kicked off, but it stalled at some stage, I think.
Well, you hadn't done any procurement for a while. In fact, you've done
Indeed.
no procurement since 2010, had you?
Well, that's the whole point of the discussion with Barbara, yes.
Indeed. So, in a nutshell, is it the case that you were thinking of reprocuring Carl Stokes' position because of the lapse of time since the last procurement exercise?
It was appropriate. I mean, we probably should have visited it earlier, but just pressure of work meant that it hadn't come to the top of the agenda, and now it had, and we need to investigate properly what the next steps were. So that's what I was doing with our procurement colleagues.
Yes. And are you quite sure that this was nothing to do at all with the fact that Rebecca Burton of the LFB had raised concerns about his competence twice, and a fellow professional had raised concerns about his competence on another occasion?
No, that wasn't my view. I believed, as I've said already, that we had taken action and spoken to Carl about those issues, and he addressed them. So no, but it was beyond timely to reprocure, and so we were looking at it.
Did you, in fact, undertake a reprocurement?
No, I spoke to my colleague. We got as far as setting out the activities that Carl was undertaking for us, and my recollection is my colleague went off to do some work on it, and I had further conversations with Barbara, and it didn't at that stage get taken forward, and I don't know what the plan was going to be. It was sort of, I was looking for a lead, really. We've
seen no discussion about reprocurement at either the Health and Safety Committee or the TMO executive team or the TMO board. Would that be right? There was no discussion, so far as you knew, of that topic within those groups.
To the best of my knowledge, you may well be right. I mean, I report to Barbara, so we were having those discussions, and she was giving me a steer about what action she wanted me to take, and I was taking those actions and then going back to her and waiting to be guided with what was next.
Can I ask you to look, please, at paragraph 143 of your first statement, page 32. You say at paragraph 143, in the second sentence in the paragraph, there was an assumption made by Carl and myself that arrangements at our premises which were not negatively commented on by the LFB following audit were deemed by them to be satisfactory. Why did you make that assumption?
I think it was probably more Carl's assumption than mine. I think it's reasonable when they're doing a visual inspection that anything that's obviously within the communal area that can be observed. If there are any concerns, then I think it's reasonable that if they're not being highlighted, to kind of assume that they weren't highlighted as a deficiency and they're not raised as a minor deficiency, then I think that's reasonable. I think Carl's assumption went beyond that to kind of a wider range of areas.
To be clear, you'd not made a specific agreement with the LFB, had you? That their silence signified their approval?
No, nothing like that. And to be honest, there was often a different way that the individual fire officers approached their inspections and audits, so it wouldn't be reasonable to have that.
Did you think after the meeting with Rebecca Burton on the 5th of January 2016 that approach was still appropriate?
To be honest, I didn't pay a lot of mind to it. It was for us to do our assessments and get our actions undertaken, and the whole purpose of the liaison meeting was to have regular dialogue and raise any points that need clarity with the brigade.
And you quote extensively from Carl Stokes's FRA of the 20th of June within paragraph 143, and where he identifies no adverse comments and then says, 3 lines up from the bottom of your page 32, therefore it has been assumed that the fire authority were completely satisfied with these arrangements at the time of the audit and there have been no changes to the residential part of this premises or the TMA's management policies or procedures since the above fire safety audit was undertaken. Now, that was at the same, that was the same expression that Carl Stokes had included in all of his fire risk assessments since his October 2014 fire risk assessment for Grenfell Tower, isn't it? As so far as we've seen. So is it right that nothing had changed after your meetings with Rebecca Burton in November 2015 and January 2016?
That wasn't the bit she was referring to. It was about meetings with the fire brigade where he'd made comments that he'd met with the head of policy or somebody quite senior in the fire brigade and referenced conversations without being able to include any minutes, and then on further investigation there didn't appear to be any minutes, or there may have been a miscommunication or a difference of view. So that's what her issue was.
Right. I mean, it's right, isn't it, that you never picked Carl Stokes up on this generic statement, the effect of which was that he could tell from the LFB's non-statement that they were satisfied. You never picked him up on that?
No, I didn't. To be honest, I didn't really think it was a big issue. If they have an issue, they'll raise it, whether it be in a deficiency notice, enforcement notice, whatever, and that's completely legitimate. Clearly, I didn't think we could rely on that version of events, but I didn't think it was a big deal to include it.
Mr. Chairman, it's 4:30.
Yes.
I haven't finished, as you can probably tell, but I'm very close to the end, but I won't be able to finish my questions within a reasonable time after 4:30 this evening, I'm afraid. I apologise, but we are actually a day ahead anyway in relation to the time estimate for this witness.
All right.
By way of defence.
And just for Ms. Wray's benefit and for the benefit of the rest of us, how long do you think you might require her here tomorrow?
I think my own questions will not require more than an hour, and I'm confident that it will be a good deal less than that. So that is the outer estimate. We then need the normal break and the follow-up questions.
Yeah.
But I'd be confident also in assuming that many of the follow-up questions, certainly from today, will arrive overnight and won't require a longish gap tomorrow.
All right. Well, Miss Wray, I'd hoped that we were going to finish your evidence today, and perhaps you did as well. But I'm afraid it's not been possible. We lost a bit of time this morning, as you know, and things don't always go precisely according to plan, so I'm going to have to ask you to come back again tomorrow. But as you've heard, Mr. Millett doesn't think we shall be troubling you for too long. So we'll break now. We'll resume, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. And as usual, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence over the break. All right?
Okay, all right.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Miller. 10 o'clock tomorrow then, please.
Mr. Chairman.